So when we come to the first Nastika school, there are actually four important Nastika schools of thoughts, and for most important is definitely the Buddhism. So when you think about the Buddhism, we have to understand that all these Buddhist speeches were actually orally transmitted in different by the different disciples and different people who heard the speeches. So it is not written down, written down actually. So when after the Buddha's death happened in around 4th century BC, so once just even before Ashoka time. So when the death of Buddha happened at the 4th century BC, there was actually council of elders. So what do you mean by council of elders? Council means actually meeting. You can say meeting of elders. Council of elders, you can say. So elders means all the Buddhist monks during that time, all the disciples of Buddha, all the people actually related with Buddhism at that time, the elders, the respected people, they actually come together for an assembly. That is actually called the Council of Elders. And they actually started to write down all the Buddha speeches and the Buddha stories, all the things related with Buddha. So that is actually called and it was actually the first council of, there were actually four councils of happened regarding Buddhism. And it was the first council which happened just after the death of Buddha. And that actually happened in Vaishali. So it is current state in the somewhere around Bihar and the Nepal region. That kind of region is as the center of Buddhism during that time. And it is in Vaishali, all the speeches were actually compiled. All his speeches, all his sayings, all the things actually related with Buddhism, Buddha was actually compiled into text form. And that actually is called Tripatakas. So what are actually Tripatakas? We can actually roughly translate it to three baskets. So all the philosophies, all the teachings were actually compiled, arranged into three different baskets. So what are the three different baskets? It is written that it is actually Vinaya Pitaka, then there is Sutta Pitaka, and then Abhidhamma Pitaka is there. So what is actually Vinaya Pitaka? It is nothing but the rules for the different Buddhist monks. For those monks actually who are actually practicing to be Buddhist monks and all, there are different set of rules to be there. For example, there are set of things to be done for if you want to join the Buddhist monastery or the monastery, or you can say the Sangha. The Buddhist Sangha is actually called the somewhat like a monastery. If you want to join there, you have to follow certain rules, and all these rules are actually written in the Vinaya Pitaka. For example, you have to keep a blanket for 6 years, and those kind of things. For example, how much you should eat, how much if you are a monk, you should not go for rich luxury life. So you should actually eat this much. How much time you should keep certain clothes. You should actually keep this for example this blanket for around 6 years. Not after 2 years you can take new blanket. Nothing like that. So they were actually living a very modest life. So these kind of rules were actually written in Vinaya Pitaka. And when it comes to Sutta Pitaka, we can say that it is basically Buddha's teachings. So all the Buddha's general teachings for the common population and everything was actually compiled in Sutta Pitaka. And then actually the Abhidhamma Pitaka, which is actually we can call the philosophies. All the Buddhist philosophies or the things about karma, the thing, his speeches about soul, transmigration, life after death, or salvation, all these kind of philosophies were actually extremely communicated from the Abhidhamma Pitaka also. So these kind of texts were, these kind of textbooks were actually compiled, and they were actually arranged into three different sections or basket, we can say, that is Tripadagas. So that is actually called Tripadagas, and the three different sections are Vinaya Pitaka, Sutta Pitaka, and Abhidhamma Pitaka. And definitely there were a lot of other works also. After these are the three main important Buddhist works, base foundation works. Just like NCRTs for UPSC, these are the base texts from where all the other texts are actually derived. So a lot of different commentaries were definitely there. For example, Buddhism actually spread to Sri Lanka. By the time of Ashoka, definitely Buddhism was spreading elsewhere also. Sri Lanka, the Northeast India, on the East Asia, as well as, for example, to the Vietnam, to the Philippines, all those sides, everything was everywhere. Buddhism was spreading, especially during the time of Ashoka. And during that time, a lot of different new chronicles or new books were written. Some of the books actually were Dvipa Vamsha and Mahavamsha, and both are actually written or the chronicles which are from the Sri Lankan side. So from the Sri Lankan place also, a lot of different Buddhist texts are around. Two of the important things are Dvipa Vamsha and Mahavamsha. So then we have to also understand about the different Chinese travelers who actually came here. For example, Huan Sang, the Fahian also. Fahian during the time of Gupta, and Huan Sang during the time of Harsha also. We just mentioned about Huan Sang and Fahian multiple times. So all these people actually, all these travelers, Chinese travelers, whenever they came to India, whenever they were going back, they took all the Buddhist literature. They took all, not the literature per se, they were actually translating it into Chinese. They were actually taking the knowledge with them, and that also was one of the reasons why Buddhism actually spread vastly. So when we come to the different features of Buddhism, what are the different features of Buddhism, we can say? The basic concept that there is no supernatural force. Buddhism, if you will be surprised to know that Buddha ultimately told that there is no God, there is no supernatural powers. You are actually so we can say these are the that is one of the concepts of Nastika soul. So we actually think that Buddhism is actually one religion. Definitely, it is a religion. Why? Because it is worshipping Buddha. But Buddha's core teachings actually were actually slightly different, because he was actually advocating for that there is no supernatural powers, there is no superstition, there is no God belief, nothing like that. So that was the basic feature of Buddhism. There is no supernatural beliefs. So he didn't believe in any of those supernatural powers and all, and he actually believed in reality. So that kind of Buddhism, that kind of culture, that kind of thought were actually extremely modern even during that time. So he was actually advocating for reality, and all these things are actually mentioned in the Sutta Vidagas. And then he said that the world is always changing. That means the world is actually extremely dynamic. So there is nothing static. Everything is actually continuously changing. So that was his basic philosophy. And regarding the soul, he just mentioned that there is nothing like soul. So there is the world is actually soulless. It is actually you and your practice, your way of living. There is nothing like soul. So that kind of thought was actually being elaborated by Buddha. So that's why he said that it is dynamic, and therefore it is nothing is actually permanent. Everything is temporary. The world keeps on changing by its own. And one last thing actually Buddha said was actually about sorrow. So why everybody is actually sore, everybody is sad. That was the thing Buddha actually ultimately found out, that everybody actually, even though it is the most richest person, even though the most seem to be happiest person, they all are actually inside them. They are actually sad because of one or other reason. So sorrow is everywhere. Everybody has one or other types of sorrow on different levels. And what is the basic reason of sorrow? He mentioned that desire is the reason of sorrow. So everybody wants something. So everyone actually wanted to something to happen, something to do, etc., like that. So even if you are the most richest person, any type of person, you will have wishes. You will want to do something. So once you don't get to do what you want, actually, you will definitely get utter happiness. You will definitely have little bit of sadness within you always. So that was the one concept he actually mentioned, and for that, actually, he actually suggested to follow something called middle path. So one thing he wanted us to leave the desires one part. So then you will get almost happiness. Second thing is he actually advocated middle path. So because that time it was actually the end of Vedic time. Brahmanical system was actually prevalent there. There are a lot of caste based oppressions and all these things are actually definitely there. Slavery, all these things were there. So that time, Buddha wanted actually to move away from those kind of extremism. But when you go to too much extremism, too much freedom, too much like there will be chaos. So what is actually chaos? So nobody actually believes in other. Everybody starts living on their own. So there is too much chaos will be there. That is another extreme. So Buddha never wanted both extremes. So Buddha wanted a middle path. So that is why the middle path thinking of Buddha, because he actually wanted everybody to follow the middle path, a balance in life. So that is actually the concept of Buddha, and ultimately the value given to the concept of God was actually very less. So when we're moving into the different other points of Buddha, we can say that when we think about the middle path, we have to understand that there is one more thing that is actually called the eightfold path. So he also advocated middle path. He actually said that there are 8 things to be followed when you are actually part of Buddhism. If you want to believe the concept of Buddha, there are actually 8 things. For example, all the right things. What are the right things? Right mindfulness, right concentration, right effort, right livelihood, right action, right speech, right intention, right view. You don't have to memorize these things, so please don't worry about this thing. So this is only for representational purposes, but UPSC never will, will ask you these kind of things, because you're not, trying to become a Buddhist monk, right? You're only trying to become a UPSC, civil servant. So UPSC is not interested to, teach too much of religious things in you. So don't worry about this thing, but keep in your mind that Buddha promoted this middle path, and Buddha actually advocated something called eightfold path. So the 8 things has to be followed if you want to be a perfect human being. So that was actually the thing suggested by Buddha, and definitely he actually said a lot of different things. For example, the world is actually man-made. So the entire world is actually man-made or the human-made, and it is not by the construct, or it is not actually any divine construction or the God construction. It is not any God who constructed the world. It is only man-made. It is only artificial. And he also suggested that there are actually kings where different empires were that time. Mahajanabada was actually during the time of Mahajanabada only Buddha actually came. All the Buddha, Jaina, and everybody. So they were all aware about the different Mahajanapadas and kingdoms, and they said that they advocated that all the kings should be very ethical. The preachings and the daily doings of king should be very ethical. He should be very compassionate. He should be aware about the surroundings and the people or the subjects, we can say, the citizens of that time, the subjects, and he should be doing good things for the people by keeping them their welfare in mind. So all those things were actually suggested by the Buddhism at that time. So ultimately, if you want to have salvation, so salvation is actually called moksha, right? So if you want to attain salvation or moksha from your life, you have to understand that there is actually cycle of birth and rebirth. All these things are actually there. So if you want to escape from that cycle of rebirth again and again and again, you have to have what is it? Individual effort has to be there. So if it is actually up to you, it is only you who have to do things. If you do things properly, you will definitely be escaped from the cycle of continuous rebirths and all. So then actually you can actually attain moksha, or that is called salvation. Then there are two things which has to be shed down or reduced. One thing is actually ego, and the second thing is actually desire. So if you renounce or reduce or renounce these two things, you will ultimately start to feel what is called happiness. So until and unless actually you actually let go of these two things, you will have definitely some sort of sorrow or some sort of sadness within you always the day, because you want something to happen. You will be really worrying. You will be really starting to worry about things because things are actually uncertain. There will be a lot of frustration, all these things. So if you want to have happiness, renounce everything. That is the concept of Buddhism during that time. And then we have to also understand that there is some Buddha definitely founded sanghas, right? We just mentioned sanghas. Sanghas is what they're actually called monasteries, nothing but monasteries, or we can say communities. And in those communities, actually, the people, the monks who were living, they were actually called the bhikkhus, because they were nothing like they were living like a beggar, like they were actually going into the different houses for alms and all. The different people actually give them food, and that is how they actually lived, and they are actually called bhikkhus. And when we come to the sanghas actually, and all the bhikkhus were living, there were no women initially in the sanghas or the community at that time. And Buddha was also against actually women induction in the sanghas initially, but later his disciple, his name is actually Ananda. So Ananda is one of his favorite disciples, and Ananda actually convinced Buddha that if Buddhism, if your teaching has to spread, actually, then entire population has to come within your fold. So if only you teach, if only you actually, allow only men to be the Buddhist monks and all, it is actually not spreading properly. So with the Ananda's conviction, then actually Buddha allowed women to be entered into the priest or monks into the sanghas, and they were actually called bhikkhunis. So bhikkhus and bhikkhunis. So that were the men and women monks of the Buddhist communities. And there is actually one person, that is Mahapajapati Gautami. That is actually Mahapajapati Gautami, and that is actually Buddha's foster mom. So Buddha definitely has a mom, right? He is actually a prince. He has a mom in the royal family. So Buddha has a foster mom also. That is actually Gautami Mahapajapati, and then she's actually the first bhikkhuni to be inducted into a Buddhist sangha, Buddhist community. So after Ananda's debate discussions and all, Buddha decided, okay, finally you can have women priests and women monks and all bhikkhunis. So then she was the first one to be inducted into the sector also. And what was their ultimate aim? We can say that they wanted to aim the status of a theory. So what is actually a theory status? It simply means that nothing but respectable woman. So everybody wanted to, those women actually who came to Buddhism, they actually wanted to be respectable women. Who are actually respectable women? They are nothing but bhikkhunis only. And normally, when you are actually bhikkhu or bhikkhuni, during that time, even during the spread of Buddhism at that time, you will definitely get respect. So Theri is nothing but they are actually respectable women monks in Buddhism. So that was their aim, and people were definitely unhappy at that time. So that is why Buddhism actually rapidly grew. So once this concept were actually coming, all the people are actually flocking to Buddhism because the concept is good, and there were actually less discrimination over there. So all the people are actually started to follow to the sect called Buddhism. And then we have to understand the concept of Chaitya also. We mentioned about Chaityas and Viharas. So I'm not repeating it again and again. Just understand that these are special places, maybe halls like this. This is actually a picture of Chaitya from Ajanta caves and all. So Ajanta caves has a lot of 32 different caves and all. So some of the caves are actually paintings. Some of the caves are Chaityas. So what are Chaityas? They are nothing but prayer halls, especially when it is regarding to the Buddhism. And this is picture from Ajanta caves. And we have to also understand that there are different other four major Buddhist sites we can just mention. What are the four major sites we can just mention is that first thing is actually where Buddha has taken his birth. Buddha taken his, if you might not be reading it properly, so I'll just write it down. So first, actually, Buddha was born in Lumbini. So Lumbini is currently in the places of Nepal and all. So it is in Lumbini. It is actually a very famous Buddhist place. So what are the major four Buddhist sites? That is what we are actually doing here. And after he actually came out of the palace and all, he was actually roaming around. So after around 12, that much of 12 years and all, he was actually roaming around, and finally he attained enlightenment, right? So he attained enlightenment, that is actually in Bodh Gaya. That is actually in the current state of Bihar. So near to, that is actually, there is a Mahabodhi temple there right now, and it is in the Mahabodhi temple. There is a people tree, and under which he was sitting and he was doing his tapas and all. Then it's actually when he attained enlightenment. And after enlightenment, he actually traveled for some time, traveled actually, and then he actually sat down in a place that is actually called Sarnath. So it is in Sarnath, that is the third important place where Buddha had his first teaching. So then he started there, he started sitting there and started talking. People started to come in to listen to Buddha actually. So that is the place where he spread the first sermon, or you can say first teaching. That is actually the place Sarnath. And then actually, finally, his death happened. And death is actually happened in the place called Kushinagar. Kushinagar or Kushinara. So these kind of names are different names are actually being used. So just like Chennai, Madras, all those different names are actually aiming for the same place. So just like that, Kushinagar or Kushinara, or it was that place actually Buddha attained his death, and his death is actually called Mahaparinirvana, because it is the great travel. It is the great, ultimate travel to the ultimate, ultimate, this, infinity. So Buddha is actually finally embracing that death, and that is why the word is actually given as Mahaparinirvana. That is the great travel, you can say. So these places are actually extremely important when it comes to the four important states when it comes to the Buddhism. And then we have to understand that there are different emperors, different kingdoms, and all of them give patronage to Buddhism and all. One of them was actually definitely the most important one is definitely Ashoka. And you can say that in Lumbini, where the Buddha actually was born, Ashoka has visited there, and to commemorate, to mark that Ashoka visit, there is actually a pillar called Ashoka pillar is actually in the place of Lumbini. So this is the ancient pillar of Ashoka, and it has inscriptions when Ashoka reached Lumbini to mark its visits and all. So all these different historical data can be attained from these kind of pillars, these kind of rocks, etc. So this particular place of Lumbini, it is actually a very important place of Buddhism. There is actually there is actually a stupa also. There is a minor stupa also, one of the end of its complex, this compound and all. And why actually there is a concept of stupa also. So when we think about stupas, I'll just mention about the structure of stupa after that. So why there is actually stupa? We just saw the image of the Sanchi stupa, right? So why actually we mentioned about the stupa is that Buddha told Ananda, his disciple, that once I am dead, when Buddha is actually dead, his body remains should be cremated, his body remains should be distributed among the different places. And Ananda actually did the very same thing. So in those places where Buddhist remains, the ashes of Buddha actually was actually distributed. All those places, they constructed a temple-like mount, and that actually is called stupa. So stupas ultimately are the symbols of dead remains of Buddha. So that is a major concept. And the concept was already there. Stupa concept was already there. But when the Buddhism actually promoted stupas and Buddhist remains were actually contained in the stupas, then stupas gain more and more importance. But the concept of stupas were already there. So that is one important thing. Stupas did not originate with Buddhism. It was already there. That is a very important differential point you have to understand. And Ashoka also, he also redistributed all the Buddhist relics to different other newer towns. And for example, there is a town called Bharhut. So different towns are actually being found. There is another Sarnath also. So what Ashoka did was that he took some of the dead remains and all. He actually redistributed it to different towns, newer towns also. So these newer towns also became ultimate pilgrimage centers of Buddhism. So then a lot of different donations were there. Donations came to those stupas and all, because everybody wanted Buddha's blessings, right? So to gain king's recognition, to gain blessings also, a lot of donations came into those temples that are stupas. And then their names were inscribed them. For example, ivory sellers and all. Ivory is the tusk from the elephant, right? So these ivory sellers and all, they actually donated a lot of money to Sanchi Stupa and all. So they actually donated one of the gateways of Sanchi. We just mentioned about the 4 different gateways, and one of the gateways that was actually taken by the French. And Sanchi Stupa, one of the gateways is actually being promoted or by sponsored by ivory sellers and all. So ivory workers, you can say, and these gateways are actually extremely richly carved, and a lot of different pictures and sculptures were inscribed in a lot of different stories were there. So a lot of people are actually donating for the betterment of these kind of stupas. So when we think about the stupas, actually we have to understand about the structure of the stupas also. So basic structure only is actually necessary. You don't have to go deep into that. Just understand that there is actually something like the basic thing is actually the the semicircular mound. So you can see there is a semicircular mound, right? So that is actually the basic part. So there is mound, that is ultimately what is we call it as stupa, but there are different parts associated with it. So when you call the semicircular mound, that is also called as anda. That is actually the round semicircular shape, you can say. And then also above that semicircular shape, you can say there is something like harmika is there. So these kind of places, actually a rectangular block is actually placed above the stupa, above the semicircular mound, and above that you can see something like a yasti is there. You can see yasti here. It is nothing like a mask like figure. So a mask like umbrella like figure is actually a structure is placed there, and an umbrella like figure is actually created there. That thing is actually called chatras. So chatras is atop this particular harmika. So just a mound is there, and above that there is harmika, and then above that there is a structure that is called yasti, and in that an umbrella like figure is actually created. That is actually called chatras. So these four things are actually created. And the next important thing is actually the walkway. So when you go to a temple and all, you know that there you have to walk in circles around the temple, right? So in Buddha also they have to walk in that they have to rotate or revolve around this particular mount. That is actually called the pradakshina padas. So you know the particular concept, that is pradakshina padas, or you can say walkway. Pradakshina patha or walkway, and in that it is actually in clockwise direction people actually try to travel. So you can say that there is an upper walkway here, there is a lower walkway also. So people continuously walk around this particular mount to pray. So that in Buddhism also there is this rotation or revolving around on one particular thing is actually extremely important. It is a form of prayer. So it is in these walkways they actually walk in the clockwise direction. So these are the major structural things of actually this called stupas, and you can also understand about the different toranas. So what is actually toranas? They are nothing but the gateways. So we mentioned about the gateways. So normally a Buddhist stupa, we have 4 gateways, 1, 2, 3, and one in the back. So these gateways are actually called toranas. So this is the basic structure of what I call a stupa. And when you're going forward, yes, when you're going forward, not all stupas are actually extremely lucky, just like Sanji. For example, this is actually the Amaravati stupa, and it was actually, in ruins. A lot of people actually destroyed it. Some of the foreigners actually identified that it is actually extremely ancient. So a lot of people like French people and all, they actually ultimately took a lot of different stones and different sculptures to the French and British museums and all. So ultimately, it was one archaeologist. His name was is H.H. Cole. He is a British officer only, and this archaeologist actually resisted this ruins, and then he promoted conservation and all, and that is how Amaravati Stupa ultimately survived. So it did not survive actually, or at least some of the stones, some of the ruins, etc. Only that thing is actually survived, and it is only because of the effort of H.H. Cole. And Sanji actually is comparatively safer, right? Why? Because Amaravati Stupa is actually discovered much earlier. So people know about Amaravati Stupa much earlier, but Sanji was not that much aware about the what was known to the foreigners and all. So they didn't come to Sanchi directly, but Amaravati was known to everyone. So all those kind of foreigners actually came and take away the important precious things. But Sanchi was protected because it was kept hidden. So that was kept hidden for around 600 years or so. They actually was kept hidden. So that is why Sanchi I guess discovered was in 1818, something like that. So until that time, Sanchi was hidden, so it was protected. But Amaravati was known to everybody, so all the people came and rampaged it. So this is, and when we think about the other things of Buddhism, for example, symbols in Buddhism, we have to understand that earlier there were no human figures. Buddha was not represented in human format. Then how was actually Buddha represented? Buddha was represented in symbols. What kind of symbols were there? For example, people tree. So as you can see this in this particular image, you can see that the people are actually worshipping something like a tree, and in that tree they are actually hanging necklaces and all these things. So they are actually worshipping Buddha, but Buddha is actually shown as a symbol only, not in human format. So that is one important thing. The earlier only symbols, no humans. So and stupa is also one of the symbols of Buddha, because it is actually the symbol of parinirvana, right? After Buddha died, his Buddha's remains is in the stupa. So Buddha is this stupa is also a symbol of parinirvana in the Buddhism. So these kind of things are actually extremely worship. And when you think about the other symbol, for example, one other symbol is definitely wheel. So in Buddhism, wherever place actually you go, you can see something like a wheel structure is there because it actually represents Buddha's first teachings, and that is in Sarnath. And there is actually this there is one another word that is actually called Dharma Chakra. So these kind of words are actually associated, chakra, and all these things are actually associated with Buddhism. And so wheel, the concept of wheel is actually extremely important. So then we have to understand that there is actually all those people who actually treated Buddhism in the form of symbols. All the earlier people, they were actually called the Theravadins. So they actually called themselves Theravadins. However, later stages, when during the time of, especially by the time of Kanishka and all, by the time of 0th century AD, by the time of after Mauryas and everything, new type of philosophy started to come out. They are actually called Mahayanas. So Mahayanas actually, they were actually started to worship not symbols, but in the human format. So only on that thing. And then the concept of bodhisattvas. So what are actually bodhisattvas? These are stories about the previous births of Buddha. So Buddha actually had a lot of previous births also, and there were a lot of stories were created, and ultimately Buddha was there. So all the stories about bodhisattvas, and they started worshipping Buddha in the human form, and they started drawing the pictures or creating the sculptures and idols of Buddha. So all these things are actually created, and they called themselves Mahayana. So ultimately, what happened was that these Mahayana people called the Theravadins as Hinayana. So Hinayana and Theravada sect is actually the very same thing. The original name is actually Theravadas, but however, when the Mahayana sect came, they actually called the Theravadas Hinayanas, the lower class, because they are actually not worshipping Buddha as a human form. They are very pre-modern times. They are not very modern and all. They are worshipping only symbols and all, but we are worshipping Buddha in the real human form. So that is the concept of Mahayana and Hinayana. The other name of Hinayana is actually what is called Theravadins. So ultimately, Theravadins are old practices, all the rituals, the real extract teachings of Buddha, etc. They followed the Buddhism very strict in the original teaching format. But Mahayana is the modern Buddhism, we can say.